Okay, so welcome. For those who don't know me, I think most people on the call who I could see there do know me, but for those who are maybe new to us, then my name is Hayden Bratt, founder of Mindset Leadership, which I run with my business partner Nicola, who's also on the call today. So morning, Nicola. And today we're going to take you through the superpower that can change the world. And as you've seen from kind of the introduction session here, this is really talking about our ability to listen and to really understand a little bit more about listening skills. So hopefully today we're going to take you through just why listening is so important, why it is the superpower that can change the world, both at a local and a more macro level, and also some tips and techniques about how we can be much more effective when it comes to listening. So hopefully you'll find it a really enjoyable, informative, and hopefully interesting session that might challenge some of our perceptions. So I just want to flag, first of all, we put this together prior to the advent of the COVID pandemic. And so I just want to, the title, The Superpower That Can Change the World, may seem a little bit flippant given what some of our global healthcare practitioners are going through. They're the real superheroes at the moment, I guess. But even so, I still stand by the title because I genuinely believe that if more of our global leaders had have listened without judgment, we may have been better placed to cope with the current situation that we're in. We may have made better preparations for what we are currently going through if actually some of our global leaders had listened without prejudice. This is not a new thing. The risk of something like COVID has been around for a long time and was labeled as the biggest risk to our country and to nations, and yet maybe we didn't fully listen to that. So it really is an important attribute that we all need to do better at and developing, because it can make a significant difference to the way that we operate and the world around us. And that's what I want to kind of really focus on as we go through today's session. So how does listening really help? What difference does it make? Well, it helps in decision making. It enables us to be more effective in the way that we come to our decisions because we're able to take in more information the better we're able to listen, which enables us to make more informed decisions. It helps us to reach agreement. So our ability to listen to one another really helps us to tune into what's going on with the other person. And that is a great way for us to find common ground. So it can be a really important way of us reaching agreements. It's a great way for us to sell our ideas. The best salespeople, contrary to what some salespeople might tell you, but the best salespeople are those who are really good at listening to their clients rather than just talking. And when you are able to really understand what your clients are looking for, then it really helps you to serve them better. So selling is fundamentally based around our ability to listen. It's about handling complaints and dealing with conflict. Again, the more we can tune into what's really going on with people, we can understand some of the emotions and some of the drivers behind their complaints, and that can help us to deal with that. It's about influencing others, just like selling. The more we are able to tune in and connect and understand, the better it helps us to influence. And it's actually really helpful for both getting and giving information. Again, when we are able to tune in to the people around us and listen, then we're able to fully understand what those individuals are looking for, which enables us to give better information across. And finally, it really supports us with being relevant. We're able to stay connected, to stay engaged, and to really understand what's going on around us. I'm going to use the word context a lot today, but really it's about understanding the context that sits behind what we are really hearing. But before we start, what I'd like you to just do is, if you're in a place where you're able to do this, I'd just like you to sit naturally in your chair. And if you possibly can, I just want you to close your eyes. And what I'd like you to do is, I'm going to give you 90 seconds. And I want you to really focus on listening, really concentrate and be very intentional about listening. And during that time, I want you to really tune in, almost as if you are listening for the first time ever, listening with a sense of discovery. tuning into the noises that are around you, whether that's the voices of other people in your house or other people around you, whether it's noises from the street outside, whether it's bird song. I was on a call with a friend of mine today, and he was walking in the park and bird songs in the background. Whatever those noises are, it could even just be the sounds of your own inner thoughts. So I'm just going to give you 90 seconds. What I want you to do is just pause and concentrate, close your eyes and just focus on listening, and just to see what you notice. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to come back into the session, open your eyes if you've had them closed. And what I'd like to do is just on the chat, just go over there and just put in kind of what you noticed. What were your reflections or your thoughts, or what are the things that you noticed as you had that 90 seconds of just concentrating on listening? So just share some of the thoughts, some of the things that you noticed. So Joe Wick's workout in the background. Thank you, Richard. What other things were we noticing as we were listening in? So we're picking up on the noise from the fridge, music, the bass line's really annoying, kids doing the schoolwork, tummy rumble, background traffic, music on the radio, sense of peacefulness, birdsong outside, PC hum, cat on scratching post, cars, trucks, daughter playing, wife taking sheets off the beds, clock ticking, some traffic on the road, but otherwise very quiet and calm. So thank you for that, and thanks for sharing all of that information. And what's really interesting is when we stop and we listen, all of that noise was going on anyway, but when we stop and we listen and we really tune into what's around us, we're able to pick up far more than we would ordinarily do. And a lot of that sounds that are coming in, our brains filter out. Our brains are very good at filtering out kind of noises from around us so we can focus on things. But when we stop and we really challenge ourselves to listen, then we can really pick up, wife taking sheets off the bed is quite a fine noise, or cat on a scratching post. They're not things that we'd ordinarily notice, but we start to notice them as we start to pay more attention to what's around us. So thank you for doing that. And hopefully it's brought a sense of some calm to some of you as well. So that would be nice to know as well. Okay, so I want to take you through and have a little bit of a geek out session on some of the science around listening. And again, don't worry, I'm not going to go through full-on biology lessons, but I do want to bring your awareness to some knowledge around hearing from many studies that have been carried out, and that I think might just help us to understand listening a little bit better. So when we start off by looking at the brain and seeing where the process of listening takes place, when we're hearing sounds, we have the temporal lobe is activated. Now, temporal lobe is on both sides of our brain, on the left and the right. And the researchers have discovered that the left-hand side is particularly activated by language and words, and the right-hand side is activated. I'm going to go through that again because I've just had an indication my internet was unstable. So the left-hand side is activated by language and words, and the right-hand side by tones and melodies. So we use both parts of our temporal lobe then come together for us to really be effective at hearing. There is another part of the brain, and it's a really important part of the brain, which is called Wernicke's area or Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is activated, and this is the part of the brain where comprehension happens. So the temporal lobes is where the process, the physiological process of hearing happens, but Wernicke's area, which is connected to the temporal lobe, is where we go to for comprehension, translating what we're hearing into something that is understandable. So it's a really important part of our brain that's activated when we're listening. The final area of interest on the screen there is an area called Broca's area, and this area is activated when we are speaking. And what's really interesting, and again, kind of new research from fMRI scanners, is Broca's area is directly connected to both the temporal lobe and to Wernicke's area. In fact, in recent studies, there is a significant overlap between these areas. And this is quite interesting. So the overlap between when we're speaking and when we're listening, which often is part of the reason why we're sometimes really bad at listening, because we are activating Broca's area, which is the area for speech, and it's removing some of the connections and the synapses away from the area we need for listening. And it's why when we're speaking, we can't necessarily be particularly good at listening to others. One further point of interest on the slide is the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is predominantly used for sight. So it's right at the back of our brains, and it's the area of the brain that is activated when we're seeing things. And what's really interesting about the occipital lobe is it's much bigger and has far more neurons and synapses in that area of our brain than the temporal lobe. And if you think about us as a species, as we were growing, evolving, we were much more reliant on sight than we were hearing for our protection. So if you think about sitting out on an open plain and you've got saber-toothed tigers around, or lions and tigers that want to kind of kill us, we would be much more effective being able to see over distances than really to be in tune with our hearing. So as a species, we've grown to develop the visionary or the visual part of our brain much more fine than the hearing part. And the interesting point about this from a listening perspective is it's why we become so distracted. It's why visually we can be distracted a lot when we're trying to listen. It's part of the reason why I asked you to close your eyes when we did that last little exercise, because when we remove sight, we are much less distracted and much more able to tune into what's going around us. So it's just something to be aware of, that one of the reasons, again, why we maybe don't listen as well as we could is because we are very distracted by the things that we are coming into our eye line. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. So this is one of my favorite quotes. Saw this many years ago, and it's really always stayed with me. And this view that, and it comes a little bit to what I was talking about, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, is when we are expressing ourselves, we're only ever making sense of what's going on inside our minds, and we're not learning anything. So listening is such a powerful tool for us to actually stop and learn from others around us. So it's a really integral part of our ability to grow as human beings. So let's just clear one thing up. Hearing and listening are two very different, if connected, things. Hearing is the physical act of receiving sounds and noises, and this is performed by the ears predominantly. And certainly they're our most efficient way of hearing, at least. Listening, on the other hand, happens inside our brains. It's what happens when we take the sounds and the noises and we process them into something comprehensible and understood. So hearing is the physiological process. Listening is the phonetic and the comprehension process that happens to make sense of the noises. And there's a new branch of neuroscience that's looking into this distinction to understand listening more, and it's called cognitive hearing science. In effect, what cognitive hearing science is trying to sort out is how contextual cues affect hearing. It started to show that there is a strong connection between the physiological act of hearing, the phonetic act of understanding, and the brain's ability to comprehend. These cues include such things we would know about as micro-expressions of a speaker, emotional cues driven by tone, volume, energy in somebody's voice, but also all the contextual elements that sit around it, the feelings that are invoked, the understanding that comes through. So all of those contextual elements that sit around what we are listening into. So let me try and bring that to life for you. Have you ever listened to a song and you just can't quite make out certain words in the lyrics? They just aren't clear to you. Or even a song that you are convinced they're singing something entirely different. I've certainly had that experience where I've been humming along or singing along to a song and I've been singing completely different words to what actually is being sung by the artist. And the more you hear the song, it doesn't help you to understand it any better. You're not changing the contextual understanding of the song. But what might happen is you may hear that song sung either live or in a different, or by a different artist, somebody covering that song, for instance, and all of a sudden you hear something different because there's new context that's been added to it. So it can help you to understand that. Or it may be that for whatever reason you come across the lyrics and all of a sudden you realize that actually what they're singing is completely different to what you thought they were singing for all the many years that you've heard that song. It certainly happened to me. And what's really happening when that takes place is we are lacking the context for our brains to really comprehend. We can hear the melodies, we can hear the music, we can kind of interpret some of the lyrics, but we may not get the real context to enable us to fully understand what's actually being sung. And by adding that additional context helps us to understand. This is also the reason why, for anybody who is a language buff, it is much easier for us to learn a foreign language by being ensconced in the culture of that country, because we've got so much more rich contextual cues that can help us to understand what's going on in that environment. It is much more difficult to learn a language when you're in a relatively sterile environment such as a classroom. It's not impossible, we can absolutely do it, and many people have, but it's way quicker, way easier, and we normally have a much more richer vocabulary when we actually learn a language in the country where we're actually studying. So it just shows how and why hearing and listening differ. One other just kind of facts that I just want to share with you, which again was interesting as I was doing some research for this session. Again, from recent studies and our ability to really tune into what's happening in the brain when we do certain activities, it's been identified and discovered that the same part of our brain, the area around Wernicke's area, is activated when we are reading just the same way as it is when we're listening. So from a brain's perspective, in very crude terms, it makes no difference to the brain whether you are reading something or listening to something. The same activation happens. It's why we can be very effective listening to audiobooks. It's why we can listen to podcasts and take on board information, watching YouTube videos. We can listen to the sounds of the presenters. It's why webinars like this can be effective. So just like when we're reading, we may have to listen to something 2 or 3 times to fully understand and fully get the context behind it, but that's just the same as reading a book. So very interesting that the same part of the brain is activated when we join up or when we're actually reading something to listening. Which brings me into some really powerful tips that you can all practice based on neuroscience to become a better listener. And these are things you can do each and every day. If you were to do this for 5 minutes every day, you would become a much more adept listener. So the 3 tips are to watch TV without captions or subtitles and make notes on what you've seen or heard, and then play it back with the captions and see how much you got right. So watch it first of all, see what you respond to, then watch it again, put the subtitles on, and just see how much more data and information you receive. Or to read a book whilst also listen to the same book on audio. Or to have a friend read to you, or whether it's a member of your family, your children, have a friend read to you and then both read out loud at the same time. And what all of these 3 practices do is they connect up our reading and the listening part. So we're having the activation coming from 2 different senses, and it enriches our contextual cues. It enriches our ability to hear noise, but also to then have the comprehension grown. And we're training our brain to translate the noises that we're hearing into listening. 3 really simple techniques, 5 minutes a day. If you were to commit to doing that, you would make yourself a better listener. Okay, so I want to delve in a little bit deeper into why listening matters to us. Why does it matter in the kind of our working lives and as we go about our jobs? Well, about 70% of the day is spent actively communicating. In effect, all of the time when we're not asleep, we are communicating in some way, shape, or form. So 70% of the day, we are actively communicating to others. And of that time spent communicating, nearly 45% on average is how much time we spend listening. So the greatest proportion of our time spent communicating is actually spent listening. There's just 30% is speaking, 16% reading, and just 9% writing. And interesting enough, in studies, the more senior you are in an organization, the more likely it is that you will spend more time listening. So we often, the more senior we are in a business, we have other people coming and feeding us information and we're listening to what they're sharing. So we spend more than the 45%. And in some instances, it can be up to 75 to 80% of our time actually listening to what other people are telling us. But what's really interesting is if we look at kind of leadership development as one kind of facet of people development, just 2% of leadership programs focus on this critical communication skill around listening. A very, very small proportion of leadership development is focused on this critical communication skill. And again, if you think about your own history of learning and growth, we spend lots of time being trained how to influence people. We have lots of time being trained how to present with impact, to negotiate, to communicate, to deal with difficult conversations, to articulate ourselves, to improve our written communication and the way that we structure our emails. Lots and lots of help is out there to enable us to broadcast more effectively. And yet we spend so little time really thinking about the other side of when we're on receive. And it's the thing we do most often. There is this assumption that we are all talented listeners, and that is blatantly not the case. This literally is a superpower that we all need to work hard to develop. So there's a great quote on here. Most important thing to listen to is what's not being said. This was said by a guy called Oscar Trimboli, and Oscar is he's based in Sydney, Australia. I definitely, if you're interested in this whole concept that I'm sharing today, definitely check out Oscar. He's a real leading light in the area of kind of deep listening. So I definitely get you to check him out. But one of the things that Oscar asks the question is, what is the purpose of listening? So I'm just going to pull up a quick poll for you. And I just want you to pick which of these three do you think is the purpose or the principal purpose behind listening. So you should hopefully have the poll on your screens. So I just ask you to place your votes as to which of these three do you think is the purpose behind listening. So I'll just give you another few more seconds just for final votes to come in. Okay, great. So let's just end that there. Okay, so overall, the majority of people on there said to fully understand what's going on in the minds of the other person, the person that you're listening to, which actually is right. And so well done to everybody who was who answered that. So one of the things that Oscar shared, and it really kind of took me back because it was different to what I perhaps had been taught in my own experiences of thinking into listening. One of the things that Oscar shared was the purpose of listening is to create a space to enable the person who is talking to you to sort out their own thoughts. Listening is a giving act. It's an act where we are not, or we shouldn't be approaching it from a selfish perspective of trying to understand, but actually to create a space so the person who's communicating is able to understand their own thoughts. And I want to just make some sense of this for you to kind of bring that to light, because I say that was a bit of a revelation for me. It was different from perhaps what I'd perceived listening to be about. So 3 really important numbers for you. The first of which is 125. So 125 represents the number of words in a minute that we are able to express or communicate, the amount of words that we're able to enunciate within a minute. So roughly the pace of talking for most people, certainly most English speaking people, is somewhere between 125 and 150 words a minute, depending on how quickly people talk. So somewhere in that region. 400 represents the number of words that we are able to listen to in a minute. So we can take on board somewhere in the region of 3 times as much information and be able to process it as we can actually articulate. So roughly 3 times as much we can listen to. This is the reason why if you're at a meeting or if you are at a party or a gathering, we can hear multiple conversations going on. We can tune into them and we can actually take a lot of that information in. We're able to really process these things much more effectively than we've perhaps even recognized for ourselves. So about 3 times as effective listening as we are as talking, or 3 times as rapid. But then 900, this is the real kicker. 900 represents the number of words that we can think about in a minute. So 900 thoughts or words will cross over our brains within a minute, but we can only ever express about 11% of what's going on in our head. So we've got all of these words jumbling around in our brains, and we try our best to articulate them and to express them, but we can only ever get about 11% of what's going on. This is the reason why you might hear people say, well, that just didn't come out right. That wasn't what I meant. Or my brain works faster than my mouth, we often hear people say. And it's often that what we express is almost a facsimile of what's going on in our brain rather than a true representation. It's like a really cheap copy of what's going on upstairs as we're thinking. So if somebody is expressing just 11% of what their thoughts are, Oscar's quote becomes ever more important, because what really matters is not the 125 words they're expressing. What really matters is the 775 words that they haven't shared. What's actually not been spoken about, that hasn't been expressed, because no matter how good a speaker is, no matter how practiced they are, they may not always express the words that they want to share in the right way. They may not always bring those thoughts to bear in the most clear articulation. So for us, it's really important for us to tune into what's not being said rather than what is being said. So just to build on this and to again kind of focusing on to why we may be not as great listeners as we think we are. There are 5 levels of listening. So the 5 levels of listening model, most of you probably will have seen this. But the first level of listening is not listening. We just simply aren't tuned into what's going on around us. We're choosing to ignore what's there either maliciously or blatantly, or we are just in our own world and we're thinking about our own thoughts. There'll be times, probably in this webinar already today, where you will have switched off for whatever reason and you haven't been listening, and that's just kind of normal. We often get distracted, and I'll talk a bit more about distraction a little bit later on. So the first level and the lowest level is not listening. The next level up is pretend listening. This is where we kind of make the nods and the appropriate gestures, but we really aren't tuned into what's going on around us. So this kind of fake listening that we sometimes fall into. It can be while you're at your desk, when we were back in office locations, and somebody comes over and starts talking to you and you're tapping away at your screen, and you really are not actually tuning into what they're saying. The third level is selective listening. So selective listening is where we tune into what's interesting to us. This is probably the place as human beings that we hang out the most. It's the place where we probably operate, which is where we just tune into the interesting things that trigger our needs for information. So if we are somebody who is listening to help us understand, we often fall foul of this trap of selective listening. We tune in. You often see it when people are talking about holidays, and the minute that somebody describes somewhere that they've been, the person who is listening no longer is tuning into their story about their experience of New York. They just want to tell you about their own experiences of New York. And it's that selective listening. I've heard New York. I want to just tell you about my versions. I'm not interested in your story. The next level up from that is attentive. This is where we get into a much more effective level of listening. So attentive, or can sometimes be called active listening in some places, but attentive listening is where we give our full attention to the speaker, where we're really tuned in, we are removing distractions from us, we're paying attention, we are actively involved in the conversation by showing that we're attentive, giving people the confidence that we really are hearing them and we are listening to them. So that attentive listening is a really good level. But the best level of listening to get to is what we call empathetic listening. This is where we are listening not just to what's being said, and we're not being just attentive to somebody, but we're being really present. We're listening into these 775 words that aren't being shared, as well as the 125 that are. We're really tuning into the emotions. We're tuning into the tone of voice and the expressions that are on there. That real context that I talked about earlier is what you really get when you move into empathetic. Attentive listening is good. It will give us a good understanding of what's being shared. But the problem with attentive listening is we don't always tune into, because we're not fully present. We're not really tuning into the emotion and the context that sits around it. So for us, and as a trained coach, this is the area that we are trained to get into, is this place of empathetic listening. It takes real energy, because it's not our normal mode of listening. It takes real effort and concentration and focus. But the best way to think about empathetic listening is if you ever had a conversation with somebody where it feels like the rest of the world just disappears, where you are so in tune with the other person that you feel like you're in some kind of bubble, protected from everybody else around you. And that's a good indication that you're in this empathetic listening place where time just seems to stand still and all that's there is the other person who you are engaging with. That's when we're in this real mode of empathetic listening. But they're quite rare experiences for many. So just sharing some of the listening rogues galleries. So just tuning into some of the things or some of the ways that we lose sight of our ability to listen. So the first of these is what we call the drama queen. So the drama queen is the character who gets so involved in the emotions and the drama of the thing they're listening to that they lose objectivity. They really want to go hunting for the juicy gossip. They want to feed their desires for the drama, the emotions, the upset or the angst that's being caused. And they're often ignoring what the other person wants to share. They're not really interested in what you want to tell me about. I just want to hear all of that kind of gossip. So often the drama queen can be one of the ways that we really do negatively impact our ability to truly listen to the person in front of us. The next and probably the most common of our rogues gallery is the fixer. The fixer is the character who's so focused on solving the problem, on the other people's problems, that they try and be one step ahead. They're the character who will constantly interrupt. They're the person who wants to really selectively listen because I want to hear all the problems so I can come up with a solution. They're the type of person who might talk over you. They'll certainly finish it by giving you their opinions and their thoughts about what you should do in that circumstance. They can be calculating, typically only focus on what they need in order to solve the problem. And once they think they've solved the problem, typically they switch off. Their work here is done. No need to thank me. I'll go on my way. And then the final one is the princess. This character is a little bit self-obsessed. It's all about me. They're more interested in what's going on in their own head than what's in the other person's. They often create more confusion than they solve. Their attention is focused on themselves and they're not very active or present in the conversation. What you'll find with somebody who has this kind of princess character is whatever they hear, they like to turn it into something that matters to them. So I'm not really interested in you sharing your story with me. I just want to have something that matters to me, that makes me feel important or that I can relate to. I'm not really here for you, I'm here for me. So 3 of the most common reasons why we may not be as effective at listening as we perhaps could be. So not sure if any of those resonate with some, but we're all probably guilty of all 3 at times. But they are definitely ways that we get in the way of ourselves. So I'm just going to share with you some myths of listening. And again, for those who have had some training in listening skills, often some of these myths really are born out of some of the training we've received that is not necessarily as helpful as perhaps it was intended. And again, just going to share a little bit of that as we go through. So the first myth is that listening is natural and easy. It is absolutely not. So we've already seen hearing is a natural process that the majority of us have the ability to do and capability for. And even people who are born with hearing impediments or deaf, there have been studies done, and there have been research done, and some tools to help, obviously, the development of hearing aids. But also there was a recent experiment where somebody had in effect, a hearing aid implanted in their chest, and the brain built new neural pathways to pick up the noises, so they could actually almost replicate the process of hearing, but with receptors in the chest as opposed to using the ears, because that's where they had a physical problem. So the brain can actually take sounds and noise and transfer into listening, but it is a complex process that we need to train the brain to do. It's not something that happens automatically. So the key thing around this is, if we are not practicing listening, if we are not spending time investing in becoming a better listener, we will always fall short of our capability in this area. So it's something that needs work and effort. Myth number 2, we often hear that you can improve your listening by focusing more on the speaker, by concentrating on the speaker more. And yes, being intentional and having focus is important when we think about listening. But listening does require concentration, but simply trying to focus more will not make you a better listener. In fact, all of us, no matter how good we are, will become distracted at times. And it's a little bit like if anybody has practiced meditation. When you're asked to meditate, there is this kind of feeling that I've got to clear my mind, I've got to empty my mind. But the reality around meditation is the thoughts will keep coming and keep passing, and it's a little bit like clouds against a blue background. These thoughts keep crossing over your mind. And the key thing around meditation is about recognizing when you've been distracted by a thought and bringing yourself back to the here and now and the present, and to focus on the inner self. And it's exactly the same when we think about listening. We will all get distracted when we're in conversation with other people. I talked to her about the impact of the occipital lobe and their sight. There will always be things that will distract us. We should try and minimize the distraction, but there will always be things around us that will distract us from the person in front of us. What makes being a really effective listener is the ability to notice when you're distracted and bring your attention back, rather than being unaware of the distraction taking place. So it's not about removing distraction, it's about noticing when it happens and bringing your attention back. So to become a really effective listener, yes, we do need to concentrate, but we actually need to start by listening to ourselves. So really powerful and effective listeners, like many things in life, starts with self-awareness. The more aware we are of what's going on in our own mind, the more present we can be and the more giving we can be for those who we are actually listening to. So myth number 2, just concentrating on the other person will not make you a better listener. We have to concentrate on ourselves first and foremost, and then give ourselves and be present for the other speaker. Myth number 3, is to listen carefully to what's being said. Now, we already know that just listening carefully to what's being said is going to leave us short of what's really meant, the 125 versus the 900. And I love this Chinese character, which is called Ting, and Ting relates to or is the Chinese character for listening. And what's really fascinating about the Chinese character Ting is it's made up of 6 dimensions. So there are 6 facets to listening within the Chinese way of articulating what it means to listen. 2 of those are hearing and seeing, but the other 4 are focus, feeling, presence, and respect. So listening is all about this kind of giving, the environment we create, the space we invite others into, that has listening and empathy and emotion built into it. So listening is way more than just tuning into what's being said. It's about tuning to everything, that holistic approach to what's going on around us. So myth number 3 is just focusing on what's being said more and concentrating on the words may actually make us into a worse listener rather than a better listener. Myth number 4, and this is definitely one that's been trained out on active listening type courses, is to summarize what you've been said as a way to demonstrate this active listening. And don't get me wrong, summarizing can be a powerful way to aid understanding and to bring discovery, and certainly as a coaching technique, it's one that we would use. But we also need to be quite wary of summarizing and summarizing too early. Again, if we go back to our 125, 400, 900 formula from earlier, when we summarize, we're only summarizing the 11% that we've heard. And what can happen if we summarize too soon, if our first point of call is to jump into summarizing what we've heard, then often we lock the thought process into those 125 words, and we miss out on potentially more of what was there. So summarizing it is a good technique. It can be used, but we do need to use it with caution. It's more effective to, rather than summarizing back what I've heard, to ask some questions to understand the context around what I've not yet had the opportunity to hear, the opportunity that I can't summarize it because I've not yet heard it. So how do I discover the other 775 words that might hold greater meaning than the 125 that I have heard? So we need to create that space. The final myth is about questioning. And again, don't get me wrong, as a coach, we are practiced and trained in asking questions, and questions can be really powerful. But where we want to focus our questioning is not on the content, but the context. And this is really important. Again, I don't want to ask questions about what I've heard, the content. I should be asking my questions around the context. What sits around what you're sharing? Again, that great quote from Oscar that we saw earlier, what's not being said, is a really powerful question. What is it that you're not saying? What else would you like to share about this situation? How are you feeling at the moment when somebody shared something? So really important that we don't just tune into, again, the words or the content, but we tune into the context, the emotion, the situation, the environment, the factors that are driving those thoughts that are being expressed in whatever way the person is expressing them. So be really careful as to become a more effective listener, that we don't tune just into content, we tune into context. So just to bring this session to a close before I open up for our questions, just some top tips for us to listen better. So I've said it repeatedly throughout the session, but context really matters. How do we tune into the context surrounding what we're hearing? It's critical for our understanding. And we need to practice our ability to explore that context. How do we discover more of what's going on in this conversation that we're having to really understand what sits behind the words that we're hearing? So practicing and tuning into that context and really thinking to yourself, what sits behind this? I was doing this session yesterday with a company, and there was a really lovely phrase that somebody did when we did the silent listening activity, and they put what they were listening to was the silence behind the noise. And that's a really great thought to have, is what's the silence behind the noise? What's the silence that sits behind the words you're hearing? Because that's what's more interesting sometimes than the words we're hearing in their first place. So understand that context really, really is important. Second one is time for practice. We've already seen it's not natural, it's not instinctive, it's something we have to train our brains to do. So the more we can practice listening, and this is great if you've got a colleague, we can do this now when we're in our times of lockdown. We can get on a Zoom call, preferably, because then you've got the facial cues and you've got the context there as well. So much more effective than perhaps if we're on a telephone call. But that ability to just tune into the other person is really important. We can practice that. We can do a 5-minute conversation with somebody where we just want to practice our ability to listen, practice our ability to tune into the context rather than just what we're hearing, to move into that place of empathetic listening, so that full listening versus being in that selective listening mode where we're just hearing out for triggers so we can then start sharing our own thoughts. So getting to a place of practice, working with an accountability buddy is a great practice for listening, where you just say, let's just have a 10-minute conversation and we're going to each really practice this skill of listening. It's something very simple that we can all do. The mirror, the third image over there, is this real focusing on yourself, tuning into your own inner world and building your self-awareness. When am I becoming distracted, and what distracts me? What are the things that I can do to remove some of those distractions from my space? Do I know that I'm a better listener when I'm away from my workstation? Do I know that I'm a better listener when I don't have my mobile in eye line? Because many of us are distracted by our mobiles, even just seeing them because of that, the role of the occipital lobe. Just the visual representation of a mobile can sometimes make us get distracted from what we're actually tuning into. So what's going on with me? Really becoming self-aware. If you want to become a better listener, you have to start with yourself and be aware of your own capabilities around listening, but also your own limitations. How well do I understand? How well do I build the comprehension behind what I'm listening to? And then the final image there is about empathy. As I said earlier, listening is a giving activity. It's about creating the space for the other person. And just like any other facet of emotional intelligence, we can build empathy, we can learn it, we can develop it if we choose to. But really stepping into the shoes of the other person is critical when we're trying to get that context. Can I really try and challenge myself to understand where they're coming from and what's going on in their mind, principal purpose behind listening, rather than being focused on self and focused on what I'm trying to get out of this or my worldview. So how well can we position ourselves into the thoughts of other people and focus on that? So I'll open up the chat for some questions that may come in. So if anybody's got any questions, then I'd love to hear them, and happy to stay online to take any questions that you've got. So great comment there from Lindsay that came in earlier on. I did see that as we were going through, but absolutely right, Lindsay, that often the most important item is the last thing patients tell doctors, is definitely the case. So we go through this whole process of explaining, and it can often happen in meetings as well, where what seems like an aside at the end is the critical thing that actually the person wanted to express, but they've just had to work through their thoughts to get there. So really great point. Thank you for that. Richard, the myth number one was that listening is natural and easy. It's the myth that we can all listen. Most of us have the ability to hear, but we don't necessarily all listen effectively, and we're not always as good as we could be around listening. So it's really building on that where you need to practice this. Listening just doesn't happen by chance. It happens by intentional, purposeful practice. So hopefully that helps clarify that one. Does anybody else have any other questions this morning? Absolutely, yeah. Let me just, I'll pull that back up on the screen for you, Lindsay. So let me just bring that up. So this is the Dalai Lama quote. So when you talk, you're only repeating what you already know, but if you listen, you may learn something new. So hopefully that was the one that you were thinking into, which is really, say, very insightful quote for us. Does anybody else have any other additional questions that they would like to ask? If not, then great. Thank you. What I would really appreciate if you don't have any questions, but if it'd be really helpful for me if I could just get some feedback. So on the chat function, I'd really love to know what have you found most valuable about this session. It'd be really great for me just to understand what have you got from the session itself and what's been kind of most important to you. So if you are thinking of kind of leaving the session just before you go, if you wouldn't mind just dropping me a note in the chat, that'd be great. Just had a question come through on the Q&A. So do you have any tips for trying to listen to someone when you're somewhere noisy, busy in a cafe? Really great question. It's not something we've overly stressed on in terms of distractions, but it is a real kind of challenge for us. So I guess the first tip would be ideally find yourself an environment that is quiet as much as you can, or find a space where you are in a slightly quieter area if you do need to be in a cafe. I spend a lot of time, or was spending a lot of time in London in my role, and often I'd need to take calls, and it's about trying to find the right environment to do them. If you do need to be in a cafe, what I would encourage you to do is find yourself a corner and try and turn away from the cafe. So take out the visual noise. Take away the visual distractions as much as you possibly can. So even if it's turning to face the wall, because you're removing the distractions, and the only distractions you then have is kind of the the noise distractions, and our brains are better at filtering out background noise than they are at filtering out visual things because of the dominance of the occipital lobe. So if you are in a place where you absolutely have to be around other people, then as much as you possibly can to remove those visual distractions by trying to position the way you're sat to focus on, say, whether it's the wall in front of you or your notebook in front of you at the table, which is try and restrict that kind of field of view from some of the other distractions that take place. And then it's really about kind of trying to intentionally focus, setting that intent that I am going to really listen to what the other person's sharing. But again, not losing sight if you're on a telephone call, perhaps a little bit more difficult at times, but when we're on a telephone call, what's sitting behind what's been sharing? And this is where our contextual questions can be really powerful because they help draw us in and keep us focused on what we're not hearing, but rather than what we are hearing. So hopefully, Alexander, that's a couple of tips that you could use that would help you when you're in a very busy environment that might help to deal with some of those distractions. Just going to go forward to the end again. Any more questions coming in? Okay, so a couple more coming in there. So self-reflection, be less focused, truly listen to the other person. Okay, thanks, Adam. Thanks for that. And again, recognizing some of our own challenges at times can be really, really valuable. Tips to calm a situation when someone comes to you angry and can't express themselves. Great question, because again, this happens quite a lot, doesn't it? Where people come to us and they are in an emotionally charged state, whether it's excitement or whether it's anger, whether it's frustration, whatever's driving it. This is really where we absolutely need to focus on the context, trying to understand what's causing the emotional reaction before we get into the understanding the content part of it. So creating that space is great. So if we are able to maintain a calm emotional state ourselves and create a space where we demonstrate we're actively listening to the person, we are really tuned into them, but trying to understand first of all what's caused the emotional reaction before we get into what it is that they're actually trying to tell us. So often if somebody's coming in and they're really angry about something, we often go straight to, well, what is it? What's the thing that you're trying to tell me? Well, actually, what's the thing that's made you angry in the first place? And tell me about what's happened. Before what you want to share, tell me about what's happened and create this kind of space where I'm presenting an environment where the person can explain their situation, and then we can get into unpicking what it is that they want to express. So staying calm ourselves, creating a calm, receptive environment for the person to express, and then hopefully that will help them to explain some of the angst behind it, and that can hopefully give them the opportunity to share. We've got a question here around examples of contextual questions. So contextual questions would be things like, what aren't you saying? What aren't you sharing? What's happened? How are you feeling? What's going on with you today? Those questions that aren't directly focused on the content, but they're trying to understand what's happening in the mind of the other person. So how are you feeling? How's your day been so far? What's led you to think this way? What's happened that's made you make that statement, etc. That type of question that kind of digs behind the content to help you understand what's going on in their thoughts. It's really trying to dig into the 775 words that you've not heard. So hopefully those are a few examples that help you to think into what a contextual question might look like. Thank you, Martin. I hope it wasn't the second. It might have been the first. It's fairly new to me as well. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. And yes, Wesley, absolutely. I think we all need to make listening an active habit. So thank you for your comments there. Okay, so again, if anybody's got any more questions, then I'm happy to stay on the line. If not, thank you all for your comments and your thoughts. Again, any other additional thoughts would be really helpful to have. But yeah, I'd really appreciate your time this morning. So, and hopefully it's been useful. Great, thanks. Thank you, Martin, for the summary to Adam. Adam sharing that your summary has helped him just capture that again, which is great. So really helpful. So thank you, Martin, for that comment. Definitely very helpful. So thank you, Adam. Great to see you. Thank you for the note there, Catherine. We will be sending out the recording as well, so you can go back through to have a look if you do want to go over any of the content a little bit further to help you with making any more notes on this. So we will send that out immediately after the session. You're very welcome. And again, feel free to share that recording with anybody else you think might find this useful. So, if people would you think would benefit from it, then please feel free to share it. Thank you, Sophie. Great to have you on. Really appreciate your time this morning. And I wish you all a great rest of the day. Have a wonderful weekend too, and enjoy. And we will see you again soon. So we'll be sending out and I think we've already sent out, or we have already sent out our next webinars. But we'd love to have you on the next one. So please do come back and join us then. Okay, so couple of people still online. Again, feel free to, if there are any additional questions, happy to take them. But if not, I'd say I wish you a wonderful weekend, and look forward to sharing some more content with you in the coming days. So Roland, I can see that you're still on the line there. Is there anything else that we can help you with this morning, Roland? Any additional questions that we can support you with, or anything else that you'd like to know? I've just unmuted your mic there, Roland. So if you want to talk, then that's fine to do so. I'm just going to stop.